Welcome back. Interesting enough, as the UNGA holds this week, September 21st, is the International Day of Peace, when people around the world commemorate and strengthen the idea of peace both within and among all nations and peoples. This year's theme is Sustainable Development Goals, Building Blocks for Peace. To mark the event here in Nigeria, the Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution is collaborating with the UN Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, the UN Development Programme, Nigeria Stability and Reconciliation Programme, the Nigeria Security and Civil Defense Corps, and Young Youth Network for Good Leadership in Nigeria. They all held a peace press conference in Abuja, where Director General of the IPCR, Professor Osita said, peace building provides the enabling environment for sustainable development. He said there was need for Nigerians to collaborate in the achievement of peace. As for the UNDP Peace and Development Advisor, Mr. Zebulon Takwa, all these 17 development goals are pillars of peace, but he encourages that we look inwards to see how we can work to make peace a reality. And speaking of peace, I take you back to our leading story about U.S. airstrikes hitting Syrian troops despite a ceasefire agreed with Russia and the United Nations. The U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Samantha Power, addressed the issue on the sidelines of the UNGA, but blames the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria and the Russian government.
We are still gathering information at this time, but we have been able to confirm that earlier today, the United States struck what we believe to be an ISIL target. We halted the attack when we were informed by Russia that it was possible that we were striking Syrian regime military personnel and vehicles. We are investigating the incident. If we determine that we did indeed strike Syrian military personnel, that was not our intention. And we, of course, regret the loss of life. This said, even by Russia's standards, tonight's stunt, a stunt replete with moralism and grandstanding, is uniquely cynical and hypocritical. At the UN General Assembly, Russia decided to join the Assad regime, escalating the conflict, and perhaps worst of all, itself adopting some of the regime's worst practices, hitting hospitals, hitting refugee camps, hitting markets, without a single public expression of remorse. Now, because of a single airstrike, a strike that if it struck regime forces, did so in error, a strike that we have swiftly acknowledged and committed to investigating, again, none of which the Assad regime or Russia have done in their airstrikes on innocent civilians, now, of all times, Russia calls the entire UN Security Council to convene urgently so that it can stand up here and express outrage. Imagine how often this council would be meeting if we were to gather every time the regime or Russia struck a hospital or a school or a breadline. Imagine if we gathered every time they blocked vital aid from reaching children who are eating leaves, so that they do not starve to death, or who block medicine from reaching people who are dying every single day because they are forced to drink foul water and because they have no antibiotics. And let me just state for the record that we believe that Russia should in fact be convening an emergency meeting this evening. An emergency meeting with the Assad regime, which is bombing in defiance of the cessation of hostilities, which is continuing its practice of death by 1,000 paper cuts, in starving Syria's civilians. The regime has to stop bombing those who have signed up for the cessation of hostilities. And Russia has to deliver the Assad regime. And so why are we having this meeting tonight? It's a diversion from what is happening on the ground in Syria. When you don't like the facts, try to create attention somewhere else. It's the classic magician's sleight of hand. Get the world and the media to focus here so they maybe take their eye a little bit off what's happening over there. What's happening over there is so important. It's jeopardizing something that gives the Syrian people a chance.
And here's the Russian response to the U.S. accusations.
You know, we convened the consultations of the Security Council because the United States has bombed the Syrian armed forces in Deir ez-Zor. And Deir ez-Zor, of course, is one of the most important symbols of resistance against ISIL, because it has been besieged by ISIL for a very long time, for a couple of years. The Syrian armed forces suffered serious casualties, over 60 soldiers killed, over 100 soldiers injured, and there is a threat of ISIL advancing on Deir ez-Zor. Fortunately, our air forces, Russian air forces, were able to come to the assistance of the Syrian armed forces, so we hope this tragedy of ISIL taking Deir ez-Zor is not going to happen. Having conducted this airstrike, the United States has violated two of its commitments. One is the commitment to cessation of hostilities, which the United States undertook together with us in February, and which we reconfirmed just a few days ago. And the other is the commitment the United States gave to the government of Syria when the United States started its air campaign 2 years ago. It is quite significant and frankly suspicious that the United States chose to conduct this particular airstrike at this time. Why would all of a sudden the United States choose to help the Syrian armed forces defending Deir ez-Zor? After all, they did nothing when ISIL was advancing on Palmyra. ISIL made a 100-mile march without being attacked by the coalition. All of a sudden, the United States decides to come to the assistance of the Syrian armed forces defending Deir ez-Zor. It is quite significant, and I would suggest not accidental, that this happened just 2 days before the arrangements, Russian-American arrangement, were supposed to come into force. In all my years in the United Nations, that is over 10 years, and in all my years in international life, I've never seen, which is over 40 years, I've never seen such an extraordinary display of American heavy-handedness as we're witnessing today. As I was talking in the Security Council, sharing our analysis and frustration over the situation of Syria, Ambassador Power chose to talk to you. The only thing her deputy had to say in response to my comments was that the U.S. is investigating what has happened at Deir ez-Zor. As Ambassador Power walked in, first thing she said, she was not interested in what I had to say, because what I was saying is a stunt. So there is no point in my listening to Ambassador Power. So I decided to leave the room, my delegation is there, and to share my reflections with you. Suppose this scenario is subjected by the fact that at times one had the impression that the United States is trying to protect Nusra on the ground. Colluding, well, we don't have specific evidence, but delivering airstrikes, and quite effective airstrikes, 60 people dead, 100 people injured, against those who are fighting Nusra, one wonders. This is demagoguery of the highest order. Demagoguery of the highest order. We have called meetings on various situations over the years. We have discussed Syria. We have discussed anything else. So this I just don't know how to respond to, because it is demagoguery beyond my ability to respond.
That the US was...
Still ahead, there was another meeting holding over the weekend, the non-aligned movement in Venezuela. To join us again.